Okay, so welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Asif Rahmani. I'm the principal contributor to SharePointVideos.com, the site that you're seeing on your screen right now. And also I'm a trainer in person and also a webcast trainer for critical path training. We have with us today Andrew Connell, and I'll introduce Andrew in just a minute. The topic that Andrew will be presenting today is going to be very near and dear to my heart personally. It's about SharePoint workflows. Now, SharePoint workflows, of course, are one of the biggest things, one of the main things that why many companies get into SharePoint to begin with, the way to automate your business processes using all types of functionality. You have the out-of-the-box functionality, the SharePoint Designer functionality, and also the Visual Studio ways of making workflows. And what Andrew will be talking about specifically is going to be a very critical component of how when you are stuck, let's say when you are at a point where you can't go any further with SharePoint Designer, and you know that there's a certain activity that you can use or a certain functionality that you would like to have that's declaratively present in SharePoint Designer, what do you do? One of the ways is to create your own activity. Another way is to buy it or to download one of the free ones out there. Anyway, I'm sure Andrew's going to be discussing that stuff, but I just wanted to put that forward, that's what our webinar today is about, Augmenting SharePoint Designer 2010 Workflows with Visual Studio 2010. Now, I see a lot of people who have been with us before in other webinars in the attendee list. I see a lot of familiar names, so thank you very much for joining again. People who are new to this webinar, first time attending, thank you very much for coming. We try to keep it pretty informal in nature, so Andrew's going to be running the show, doing the whole thing. As you have questions, go ahead and put them in the questions and answer panel, which is in the GoToMeeting panel that you'll see on the right of your screen. And I'll go ahead and type in the answers if I can. Otherwise, I'll queue them up, and Andrew can answer them throughout the presentation and also at the end of the presentation. All right. So we're here to help you answer your questions and see if we can, inform you better about this functionality. I'm going to take a minute to introduce SharePointVideos.com. Then I'll turn it over to Andrew. Excuse me. So what you're seeing here is the SharePointVideos.com site. The main goal for this site is to help SharePoint users understand SharePoint in general, anywhere from end users all the way to SharePoint server administrators. So developers, IT professionals, end users, power users, site owners, site collection administrators, everybody included. We have lots and lots and lots of videos already on the site, 240 of them right now, and about 4 of them are going up either tomorrow or the day after. So it's going to be 244 pretty soon. We're constantly adding videos to the site. They're all fully narrated videos, either by myself or a bunch of us who are on the site. So this is me, Asif Rahmani, and we also have Wendy Henry, Russell Wright, Raymond Mitchell, and Bruce Hers. That's our team. If you have a need for providing SharePoint on-demand training to your SharePoint users, what I would recommend is look into SharePoint Users Training. You can go to Products and SharePoint Users Training here. I'll go from Home tab, click on Train Your SharePoint Users. There's a video that's going to start playing. I'm going to go ahead and pause this for right now. But this talks about exactly how the process would work. And in addition to that, here we go. Here's a contact form that you can use to contact us, and we can talk more about it. A quick preview of the videos. Here's our videos, video categories, all videos. So all 240 of them, SharePoint 2007 and SharePoint 2010, all that stuff included. No code, all stuff that you can do either out of the box or the stuff that you can do using powerful tools like SharePoint Designer, InfoPath, Visio, and tools of that sort. Okay, so I'm done talking about SharePoint videos. Once again, if you have any questions, let us know how we can help you. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andrew, and just to give you a quick information about Andrew here. Andrew is one of the founders and also the co-owner of Critical Path Training. Critical Path Training employs many SharePoint MVPs, the gurus in SharePoint industry, to specifically deliver training that's very, very that's in their niche, right? So the administrators, the top administrators are doing the administrative training, and developers, they're doing developer training. I'm also one of the trainers in here. well, instructors here talks about different trainers. I'll let Andrew talk about the team and everything else that he wants to talk about. But I also have the privilege to do training through Critical Path Training. The training that I do is creating no-code solutions using SharePoint Designer specifically. Andrew does training on development, and then we have other folks doing training on administrator and others end user training as well. Okay, I think I'm done rambling here. Let me go ahead and pass it on to Andrew. You there, Andrew?
I'm here. How are you doing, Asa?
Right. I'm doing good. Yourself?
Doing good.
Great.
Let's see. So I guess I'll go ahead and do me do the change presenter stuff.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'll do that. And then let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay, so I've got promise. The first thing you're going to see is a slide. Just make sure everybody can see that first. I promise I've only got a couple slides here.
Okay. Can't see it yet, but I'll let you know.
Yeah.
There you go.
Coming across now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about today is working with SharePoint workflows, but I'm going to kind of go off on a little bit of take a tangent here from what I guess Asif was talking about earlier. Workflows are a big piece of SharePoint, and one of the areas I know that Asif likes to focus on is the SharePoint Designer workflows. My background is more in the developer space, so I would traditionally want to crack open Visual Studio before I crack open SharePoint Designer. But I think that it helps for people to understand. I think it helps for people to understand kind of when you want to go use one tool versus another one, and also kind of what I see as a better practice of going through and making these kinds of changes. And switching up when you use Visual Studio and such, and how a best way to use Visual Studio. So before I get too far into it, just real quick, just a quick introduction. My name is Andrew Connell. I'm an MVP for SharePoint Server and got a blog address and also on Twitter. If you've got any questions, I guess also following this webinar that we're doing, please go through and post them to me on Twitter, or just put my name in the question there so I see them. That way anybody else can actually benefit from the answers as well. I've got a couple books that are out that I've contributed to, also numerous articles in MSDN. Most of it focuses around either the SharePoint developer stuff or around web content management. And if anybody's wondering where's my SharePoint 2010 book on web content management, because I did one for SharePoint 2007, you're not going to see that, unfortunately. I don't have any plans to go through and to switch that up. It's just too. I don't have any plans to go through and update that book. There wasn't many changes there, so there's not a whole lot really to switch over. Okay. Now, Asif also mentioned our company that where we teach SharePoint classes. We have a class called Critical Path, or a company called Critical Path Training, and what we do is, unlike the videos that are more on demand that Asif was showing you with his organization, we do more classroom-based or webcast-based training, online training. It's for developers, administrators, power users, web designers. We have a new branding class, and end users or power end users. Got a bunch of different ways we offer the classes and stuff, so I'll let you go and check out the site and look at the different classes that are available, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll make sure that the right person gets back to you. We're real proud of all the instructors we have, because all of our instructors, we're unique from other training companies in that all of my guys and girls are, they're all contractors. And what that means is that they're all consultants in their day-to-day lives. So everyone that you're getting, when you sit one of our classes, you're not getting a by-the-book kind of a explanation there. You're getting something that happens in the real world. People who are on site with customers the week before, they'll be on site the week following. It's good for them, but it's also much better for you because you get a much more real-world experience. Okay. All right. So let's jump into the content here. Now, what I want to do is let's just kind of take a 10,000-foot view, and let's look at where SharePoint Designer makes the most sense for working on workflows, where it's good, where it's deficient, where Visual Studio it has advantages over SharePoint Designer, and then where it is deficient. And then I'll kind of pitch you another approach and show you how we can go about doing this. The approach that I see more people doing in SharePoint, especially around SharePoint 2010 now. So SharePoint Designer, I would consider this, and keep in mind, this is coming from a developer. All right, by nature I'm just a developer. Now, I think that SharePoint Designer is going to be the ideal tool for building workflows inside of for SharePoint. The reason for this is because, for the most part, the people that are going to be building the workflows are the people that are closer to the business process and know how to fix these different issues and know how to address the different business challenges and business problems that come up. When you kind of hand it over to a developer, the challenge you run into is that now developers are left to interpret what the business challenge is and how they can go through and to write their own stuff into it. So I think it's better if we can try to use SharePoint Designer for all the workflows and stuff. All right. Now, one of the things that is kind of a challenge here with SharePoint Designer is that when you go to create the workflows, not only can you go create workflows that are based on a list or a document library, but one of the new improvements that we have inside SharePoint 2010 is that we can go through and also build workflows that are more templated and use them in additional places, or export them from one site collection and import them into another one using like the sandbox solution. The end user is also going to be able to see a little bit of visualization on the status of the workflow, where it is, using this little Visio kind of thing, which is the Visio diagram, which is just going to show you kind of where you are. There's no interaction there. It just shows you where you are. Now, one of the other stories that we have, too, that's new in SharePoint 2010 was that Microsoft made a way for us to create workflows in SharePoint Designer as long as they were, I guess SharePoint Designer calls them reusable workflows. We call them more content type-based workflows in SharePoint Designer. You can create a workflow in SharePoint Designer that's a reusable workflow and then go into Visual Studio and say, I want to import a reusable workflow that was built with SharePoint Designer and make changes to it. Once you did that, it was basically a one-way operation. You couldn't export your changes and send them back to somebody to play with in SharePoint Designer. And the reason for this is because SharePoint Designer, his workflows that he builds are 100% declarative. So they're all defined using XML, and some of the out-of-the-box functions, or they're called actions or activities, that are on the server. With Visual Studio, when you build a workflow with Visual Studio, you're going to get a workflow that has a code component to it, and SharePoint Designer can't understand what that code component is. All right. Now, let's take a second. Let's look at some of the limitations we have with SharePoint Designer workflows. Some of the limitations that we have are SharePoint Designer is not capable of creating any kind of loops. There's ways you can kind of simulate it, but you can't create any kind of loops and say, like, I want to do all of this work until a certain thing happens, or I want to be, keep going in some sort of a loop or something like that. It's also not going to be easy or even possible to access content that's outside of the current site or site collection. Your workflows are always going to be bound to the current site collection they're in, and there's only going to be a limited amount of things they can do in terms of interacting and getting data out of another site inside of that site collection that you're currently in. Another thing, too, working with web services or any kind of remote feeds, it's not possible to go through and to have a SharePoint Designer-based workflow talk to web services or pull any of that kind of information out. Okay? So that's one of the limitations. If you have anything that needs to run with elevated privileges, you also can't do that with SharePoint Designer. You do have this new thing called the impersonator step, but the impersonator step is only going to impersonate the name of the identity of the person who actually built the workflow. Okay. I do see a couple questions coming here about people asking about are the slides advancing and stuff like that. I'm just making sure I'm only on the first slide here. I only have 2 or 3 slides, but just making sure that everybody still can see the slides. We're still good there, right?
Yep, we're good. That's what I've been answering.
Okay, so just a couple isolated issues that we got. So that impersonation step, that's nice, but that's only limited to the one user that's actually created the workflows. You're not able to go through and run in other kinds of elevated or impersonated users. And then the last thing is you don't have any control, low-level control over the workflow. You also don't have any kind of debugging capabilities, which is unfortunate. It's basically a black box. You put stuff in, and let's see what comes out. Hopefully what comes out is going to be what you're looking for. If not, then you just have to look at what went in and what came out and see how you can fix it. So that's some of the deficiencies that you would say that SharePoint Designer has with workflows. Now let's take a look at building workflows using Visual Studio. Now, this is a useful technique. We had this in the previous version of SharePoint, and it's a useful technique when SharePoint Designer can't satisfy certain business needs. In the past, our only really good option, I would say, was to go hand off the workflow to the developer and have him go build some stuff, or her build some stuff. The downside, though, is that this has to be done by a developer, which is unfortunate. It's also not very user-friendly because it's not going to be very customer-friendly in a sense, because once you build the workflow, it's living exclusively in code, and it's not going to be very easy to make changes to. It's also going to be very challenging to make updates to using the browser. Or using SharePoint Designer, because everything is based on code. It's also going to be very challenging to go through and to build and deploy these things. If you ever built a workflow with Visual Studio, especially one that has custom forms, you'll know that just deploying it and seeing it deploy successfully is a huge step. If the workflow doesn't work just correctly, that's okay. We can always fix that, but making sure that they actually got deployed is the big piece. There's a couple of downsides, though, to doing this, to building workflows with Visual Studio, and that's one, like I said, they're only can be built by developers. They can't be modified with using SharePoint Designer. You don't have access to that user-friendly kind of status visualization that we get with the Visio kind of visualization. That's some of the limitations that you have. There's also another limitation, I think, in that usually the people who are closer to the business process are not the developers. Those are going to be more of the power users or the people who have SharePoint Designer in their hands. So the developers aren't exactly the right people who should be building the workflows. Now, when you build workflows in Visual Studio, you do have two options. You can build workflows using either as a sandbox solution or as a full trust solution. So when it's a sandbox solution, this is going to be a little bit easier for you to deploy because you don't need to go call an administrator and get something put on the server. You can upload it to the solution gallery in the site collection, activate it, and then start leveraging it through your site collection. The other option that you have is the more traditional approach, which is we had in SharePoint 2007, which is a more fully trusted model, which involves a much higher server touch. There's many more options available to us. It's in terms of what we can do. We're not limited to certain permissions and stuff because, like the sandbox, we can't make web service calls. However, with in full trust, we can make web service calls. Okay. Now, I would say that there's another option available to us, and this is the one that I'm much more partial to, that I think that people should be strongly considering, and this is what we're going to cover more today. So instead of going through and building workflows that are in Visual Studio, instead of going to build them in SharePoint Designer and then finding out that SharePoint Designer has a limitation to where you don't have an action or activity that you need, or you don't have a you don't have the ability to do a loop or to call a web service. Usually you can build this big workflow and then find that, oh, there's this one little thing that we need, and you have to throw the whole thing out and flip over to Visual Studio and have somebody build something in Visual Studio. And that's not a lot of fun. So what we end up doing is one of the other options that we have is that we can actually go over and we can augment our SharePoint Designer workflows instead of building a workflow full-blown inside of Visual Studio. What we can do is inside of Visual Studio, we can build our own custom activities. And in SharePoint Designer, we call these actions. What these are just little encapsulated components of business logic that are going to do one very specific thing, one very atomic function. For example, you may have an activity that sends an email or creates a task or listens for a task to be updated or marks a document as a record. Those things are actions, and they take certain properties when you in when you want to add them to the site or you want to add them to the workflow. What we can do now is in Visual Studio, a developer can build a component for us. He can then take that component, deploy it to the server, and then when SharePoint Designer connects to the site collection, when you go to create a brand new workflow, SharePoint Designer is going to pull the site collection and say, what actions or activities are available to me? It's then going to go through and put a list of all of those things in there for us, all of the different, creating a list of all the different actions. And then from SharePoint Designer, I can then add those actions into my workflow and making all the changes, that I need to do to make everything work. All right. So the nice thing is that now I'm still building declarative workflows, even though there's a custom code component to this. That custom component that we're talking about, that custom component is only being used on the server itself. It's not being used in the workflow itself. Okay, so it's making things a lot more, making things a lot better, a lot more flexible to us. All right. These custom actions or activities that we build, these things can be deployed as sandbox activities, or they can be deployed as fully trusted activities or actions. We're just limited based on what we can do in the sandbox if we decide to go through and deploy it to the sandbox. So, for instance, I couldn't have an activity that sent an email or called a web service or got data from some other site collection. I think this is a much better option. The reason why I think that this whole piece of building workflows and augmenting them with Visual Studio, but building them in SharePoint Designer, the reason why I like this option so much more is because developers focus on building some sort of functionality. They don't have to worry so much about the strict business requirement. They build some sort of functionality. So people can go through and build workflows using SharePoint Designer the way they have been for the last few years. And when they come up against a little barrier and they say, I can't get past this one thing, well, then what we can do now instead is we can switch it over and say, I need the developer to build a component. When you're done building it and you deploy it, let me know, and I'll go in and be able to finish off the workflow. Okay? So that's going to give us a lot more options here. Now, before I go in and start doing the demo, I saw a bunch of questions come across that Asif has slotted towards me. So let me just go through and answer a couple things real quick. Let's see. How different is creating actions in Visual Studio 2008 versus Visual Studio 2010? So if you're used to creating actions and activities in the previous version of SharePoint, in SharePoint 2007, the story is basically the same for SharePoint 2010. The big difference is the ability to use the sandbox. That's the big piece. Okay. This is also a much more appealing solution too, because you know that your workflows are going to most likely be very easily upgradable and be more forward kind of leaning and forward accessible because workflows built with .NET 3.5, which is what we're based on in SharePoint today, do not work exactly the same way inside the next version of workflow, which is in .NET 4.0. There's no telling if SharePoint 2010 is even going to switch over to .NET 4.0 or if it's going to support it. My personal opinion is I doubt it. But I think you're a little more forward-leaning because if things are declarative, then you rely on someone else to deal with the code. All right. So for that part, nothing has really changed. Another question here: can the components be restricted to site collections? And the answer is yes. You can do that by using a sandbox solution. The other option that you can do, though, is that you can actually restrict it based on the web application, because as you'll see, there's a little change you have to make inside the web config in order for the action to show up. So you can't really, it's not really a site collection thing, it's more of a web app or a web app thing, or in the sandbox, you're definitely going to be able to limit it just to that site collection. All right? Or, yeah, just that site collection. Are there any demos coming? Yes. The next one's I'm done with slides. I just want to answer one or two questions first. Let's see. Is Nintex based on Visual Studio? So let me just kind of Nintex workflow that they sell, it's a vendor that's out there. I don't want to really promote another vendor right here. I don't think that's really appropriate here. But what Nintex does is they do something a little bit different. They have built a bunch of their own custom activities, and they've built a very friendly kind of SharePoint Designer, workflow designer, but they've done it through the browser. And they've also had a bunch of predefined workflows that you can save and kind of reuse. So it's kind of taking what we have in SharePoint Designer to the next level and opening up to more users. And it also is kind of doing a lot more stuff that we've done in Visual Studio by adding a bunch of additional activities. They wrote those activities with custom code. They're all running on the server. But when you build them, they're still all declarative. So,
and hey, Andrew, sorry to disturb over here, but I was going to say that, Nintex is definitely one of the more popular ones, but every time I talk about workflows and vendors, I just hope that people understand that there are other options too. Like there's Global 360, there's K2, there's AgilePoint, and then there's other new ones that I see popping up almost every month. There's so much stuff out there, and I just hope people evaluate everything before deciding on one vendor.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, Nintex has let's just say, a very good marketing engine. It's a good product, but yeah, they're not the only people that play in this space. Like Asif said, there's a bunch of other guys out there that are really good. So you definitely should take a look at a lot of the different ones. Okay. Okay, so let's just go jump into the demo here, and I'll come back to some of these questions in a little bit. I don't see some that are getting kind of specific, and I want to try and stay away from the specific ones for right now. Okay, so what I have here is a custom action or a custom activity that that we've built. Now, this one is going to be is built for the sandbox. The way this one works, let me just kind of show you kind of what a very basic one is going to look like. So what I did is I first went in, created a new solution in Visual Studio, and I said I added in a new project, and my new project is just a standard, let's see, SharePoint 2010, an empty SharePoint project based off .NET 3.5. Okay, so that's all I did right there. I then went into this empty project and I added in, let's see, add an item, and what I added in was let's see, where is it? I added in a empty element right here. Okay, just a standard empty element because we don't have a template for doing this inside the inside Visual Studio out of the box. Okay. So once I did that, what that gave me was just a little SharePoint project item that I could add to a feature. Well, before we did that, that's what's going to kind of register and make my activity available. What I need to do though is I need to go create the code that's actually going to be my actual action here. Now, the way this works is that you have to create a new class called whatever you really want to call it. And you're going to have to create this new method that's called an action method. You can give it whatever name you want, but it has to return a hash table, and it has to pull in a user code context, user code workflow context. And what that's going to do is that's going to give us the ability to see things like of the current item that kicked off this workflow, what's the URL of that item, maybe any kind of the web or the list item associated with that specific item. So it's going to allow us to find these different things that we're trying to work with. And then it's going to expect a hash table of things coming back. Okay. So here's where I just go through and spit back, have something called an outcome, and I'm just going to spit back something from that outcome, all right, called success. I'm just going to throw it in my hash table. So this one doesn't really do anything all that fancy. It's just very simple and just kind of writing back the word success to an outcome container. Now, what I have to do is that to get this guy to be available to me on the server is I have to go into this empty element that I've created and look at the elements.xml. And inside of this, I'm going to find this thing called the workflow actions. And inside this, I'm going to have an action node. Now remember, this is going to work for the sandbox solution here. So this is going to be available to every site inside of a specific site collection. The action that I have highlighted here, this is the one we were just looking at. You can see here that I've said, is this a sandbox function? The answer is yes or true. It's going to ask for the assembly and the class name. The assembly, what I'm doing here is I'm using a token that's available to us in Visual Studio 2010, and what that does is that basically makes it so that I don't have to type in the fully qualified name of the assembly. It's going to figure it out for me. All right. I then give it the class name, which is the namespace.type name, and then the method, that's the name of the actual action that's going to run. Now, I can also specify where do I want this to apply to. Does it apply to lists? Does it apply to document libraries? Does it apply to everything? And in this case here, I said it applies to everything. We'll look at another one in a little bit. All right. And then finally, I'm going to stick it inside of a category just to make it easier for my users to find this thing. Now, the next thing I have to do is I have to go through and set up a rule designer, and I have to set up some parameters. What the rule designer is going to do for me is it's going to, you're familiar inside SharePoint Designer when I drag an activity onto my workflow, it has a little line of text that kind of says what's going to happen. So what I want it to say is I want to say, go create a document workspace for the current item, and then I want to have this thing say outcome, set the outcome variable equal to something. Oops, don't want to do that. Equal to something. Do it again. So think of this %1 as a little placeholder. And then I said this little placeholder is a field. So what kind of a field is it? Well, this field is going to be called outcome. The text that I want to show in %1 is outcome, and I'm going to say the ID of this guy is equal to 1. Okay? And so 1 matches into %1. So this field of outcome is going to get replaced with that value coming back from the hash table. All right? I then need to go pass in, specify some parameters that are going to be coming back and forth into my workflow. One of them is going to be the context. This is going to be coming into the workflow, and this is that property you saw being passed into the method. This one right here is what's going to come out of that hash table. Excuse me. All right. Once I've gone through and built all this, I come over to my feature. It already added a feature for me when I added in the SharePoint project item that I called Workflow Actions. And if I look at the feature designer, you'll see that he's going to deploy this Workflow Actions right here. So let's just make sure we see this before we actually have anything open up. What I've got is a SharePoint site that I've created, intranet.wingtip.com. We don't use Contoso because they went out of business in the bad economy in the last few years. We open it up. I love how in SharePoint Designer it gives you that extra little list. It's like you type in the URL and it gives you this list right here, and you're looking at it going, oh yeah, that looks exactly like the site that I wanted to open up. Okay, so there we go. We got the site open. I'll come over here to the workflows, and let's create a new list-based workflow. Or actually, let's create one on we'll create one on a document library, so in shared documents, and we'll just call it Workflow 1. And you see right here, it's the SharePoint Designer is downloading necessary information from the server. That's calling, that's looking at the site collection or the web app, and it's saying what actions are available, right? So it's getting a list of all the actions that are available right now. So it should not find the one that I just showed you a second ago, because this guy is not going to be available. We haven't deployed him yet. You see, there's no action, there's no category that talks about wingtip or custom, right? So there's list actions, there's relational, there's tasks, there's utility. None of those are the ones that we have. So what I want to do is I want to add something to this list. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come over here to Visual Studio, and I'm just going to build my workflow, and then I'm going to deploy him. And this is going to get deployed as a sandbox solution. So I'll show you where this shows up, is that once I built it, if I come over here to the site settings inside my site collection and look under solutions, I should see it show up right here in just a minute. It failed. Why did it fail? Can't connect to the site that you don't know how to. Intranet. build them, and deploy. Oh, sorry. Activating features. Succeeded. So now if I come over here to Solution Gallery and refresh the page, you'll see our sandbox actions that have been activated. So I come over here to SharePoint Designer and I say I want to create a new workflow. We'll call it W2. It should find our custom wingtip actions. And you see here it's got two options here. Sandbox Action 1. That value right there is coming from our XML document that says Sandbox Action 1 for the name. Okay? And I said it applies to everything. That's why it shows up in all. All right? Then when I want to go through and add this guy, remember it should say create document workspace for the current item, outcome to something. When I add him, create document workspace for current item, outcome to, and then its variable outcome. And I can take this and bind it to outcome, or I can bind it to some other variable if I want to. All right? Because no matter what this is coming from, whatever variable I put this in, this value right here is going to come from the hash table, the value in the hash table called outcome. And I set that value in the code right here. All right? Pretty easy. So let me show you another one that is a little more complicated. It's basically this one that's kind of hashed out. So if I create this one called create doc space action, what he's going to do is he's going to go through and he's going to get a try and find the document, and then he's going to go create a brand new SharePoint workspace. He's going to create a brand new SharePoint workspace and for this one document and add that document to it. And if it worked, it says success. Otherwise, it says it failed. All right. The code for this one, though, the elements for this one, a little bit different in that it says he's only available inside of document libraries. Okay? So you can see it's really easy to go through and just kind of build one of these actions and build them up and everything. Okay? So not too bad. Let's give this guy a shot. Let's see if he works. I forgot to test him before we did the session here, so this might be, this is an unscripted demo, which you generally try to stay away from, but I'm going to do it anyway. We'll just call this one Asif, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So let's take this, go back to the browser. We'll upload our document. And actually, we have to finish building our workflow here. So let's go through and say, let's get rid of this one because this is the one that was that didn't really do anything. Let's say let's create a document workspace. Stick in an outcome variable 1. Let's then say let's log to the history list this message. Function command. Oh, not that one. Let's do the builder. Builder. Document workspace. Current item. There's a variable. Outcome 1. There we go. So I will then save my changes, publish, cross our fingers, hope everything works. Okay, so now if I come back over to Shared Docs and refresh, and go to the workflows, you should find W2. Start this guy. Let's hope he creates our document workspace. An error occurred. Error occurred in W2. So I just had a problem creating the actual it's Asif's fault. That's why. I should have named it Asif.
Sorry.
No, there's just something going on in the code. Something I did up in here, which that's fine. It's not a big deal, but you can see that it would have gone through and it's going to try to create the document workspace. It had a problem there, so it actually wrote that out that there was a problem. Okay. So no big deal that it didn't work. That's just you can still see an example of how this works. Okay, so that's one option. That's using a sandbox solution. The other option is using this, creating a fully trusted solution. So let me open up another project that I have here. That's fully trusted. All right, save those changes. Now this one's a little bit different, all right? This one's different because when you do this as a fully trusted one, you actually create these things called action files, all right? So here's what I've got here. I have a new activity that I built, and this is just a code file. I went in and said, I'm going to add a new item to my project, and it's going to be a, it's not under the workflow, it's under code, let's see, component. A component right there, all right, is all I built, is a new component. And if you look at this guy, if I open him up, you'll see that he doesn't really do anything. He's just a box here with a little icon. That's what would show up if we use this activity inside of Visual Studio. But if you look at the code behind this guy, you'll see there's a lot more stuff going on. This is just building a standard workflow, .NET workflow custom activity that has a couple of properties coming in. So in this case, it's got the context coming in as well as the user ID. These are what we call dependency properties, which if you've done anything with like Silverlight, you may be familiar with what these are. Dependency property is something that you can bind to. So if you're used to going through and like working with like little property dialogues and stuff, if I come over here in design mode and you see these three little properties over here, base class, a description enabled, those are properties I can bind to, and those are what we call dependency properties. So that's how you have to define those. Then you define a method called execute, and your execute method is going to do all the work. So when he gets called, he's going to go through and do all of this work here, okay? And in this case, all this one's going to do is he's going to write to the SharePoint history list, the history list for the current workflow that's set up. And he's going to write out the current user's name and then just a little bit of other information in there, just some random stuff, okay? When he's finished, we're going to specify that this activity is finished so that the workflows can go on to the next step. Now, to advertise this and make it available in the server, I have to do two things. I first have to come in and create this thing called an actions file. Now I can set some conditions on when this thing is going to be available. We're not going to have any conditions for ours. We're going to skip that part, and we're just going to look at the action here. This is going to look a lot similar to what we had before, okay? In the sense of I've got my action right here. Here's his name, what it applies to, if it's going to create any SharePoint tasks or anything, and what category it goes in. And then there's a rule designer. In this case, there's not really going to be much of a designer here. It's just going to say, go log to the history list, because when things get passed in, I'm going to be able to get the user ID out of there. All right. Now, the last thing I have to do is I'm going to have to come into, I'm going to have to make a change inside the web config file inside of my SharePoint site to make SharePoint Designer aware of the fact that there's this extra action that's available. When it was a sandbox action, SharePoint could do this stuff for me, but if it's a fully trusted one like this, it can't. So let me show you what the out-of-the-box web config looks like. There we go. And let me look for the, I think it's under workflow services. Yeah. So I have a bunch of actions down here, all right? A bunch of actions down here, right? What I need to do is I need to add in my own action to say how this stuff works. And so the way I'm going to do that is by using a feature, but specifically a feature receiver. So in my feature receiver, oh, sorry, I was in the wrong spot there. So you can see it's supposed to go into the configuration section, the workflow component model, workflow compiler, and then the authorized types that are available. And I specify all the types that are available, which the type is going to be my actual custom activity that I just built. All right. So I have to go through and create this modification, and when the feature gets activated, he's going to apply that modification to the web config. So let me actually show you where those are supposed to be, since I was wrong the first time. Let's see, here you go, workflow compiler. So here are authorized types and authorized rules. Those are the different section groups. Let me find, here we go. So here's a bunch of all the different authorized types for all the different activities that are out there. So if you scroll over here, you'll see some of them, like a while activity, a replicator, conditional, let's see, a lot of stuff some of these are pretty familiar, especially if you've done Visual Studio based workflows. Unfortunately, some of them, like this replicator, or especially the while activity, that's not available to you inside of SharePoint Designer because it's only because SharePoint Designer can't do any loops, right? Okay. So when that runs, I go through and I build this guy, and then I deploy him. We should see a little message that's going to say this web config file got changed. Yep, so it's going to say this file just got changed. And you see here's our new type that just got added, our wingtip custom actions. There's the namespace. What type name? That says everything inside of this namespace and that assembly is authorized to be available as an action. So if I come back over here and we go back to our SharePoint site, it's going to take, usually it takes a little bit more than just that to go through and to refresh. But I come back and in Visual Studio, if I come in and say, let's create a brand new workflow, W3, I should have this new option here for Hello World Full Trust Action. And what this is going to do is log to the history list. So if I save my changes to this guy and publish them, and come back to the browser and kick this workflow off again. So W3 is now available. Say start. It should run and it should log to the history list. It completed, so we'll look at number 3, and it says your custom outcome, your custom description, your user ID was system account because I'm doing your classic developer thing and running as an administrator, which is not a good idea, but I'm doing it anyway. But you can see I was able to write some stuff out to the history list. And you're probably looking at this saying, well, I can do that in SharePoint Designer without going through all that work. I know. This is just it's just an example of showing you here's how you build a custom activity in code that can do a bunch of work. In this case here, he's just doing something very simple, which is writing to a history list. Okay? So I see one question that came in here. I love this question when it comes to workflow because it's one that comes up quite often. So this is by Daniel. He says, this may be a bit off topic. I have a customer that would like to version SharePoint Designer workflows and build them in a dev environment and migrate them to production. I'd love to hear Andrew's ideas about ALM around SharePoint workflow. Once a SharePoint Designer workflow plus custom code workflow is written, how should a power user change the workflow with minimal impact to end users running the workflow? Now, you may not like this answer, but I think that this is something that you need to think about. And this isn't really a Microsoft workflow thing. This is more general to just the workflow business. When you want to make changes to a workflow, even if it's in response to an error or a response to a problem with the workflow or response to a business change, in reality, that change, you're really building a brand new workflow. All right? You may not agree. You may think that, oh no, it's not brand new. I'm not building something brand new here. This is the same workflow. I just got to make one small little change. Well, you're changing a business process in some sense. And that's what most people see that as, is that's not a versioning kind of a thing. Instead, a lot of people see that as that's a brand new process. You need to give it a brand new name. One of the challenges you run into when you're making changes to workflows is that if there are any workflows that are currently in flight, so they may be actively running or they may be asleep, but the one thing is certain is that they've started and they haven't completely finished, right? If you go through and you decide to get into the business of making changes to workflows that are in flight, you've got a pretty good chance at really screwing stuff up. Because if the signature of the workflow is different, then the workflow engine is going to blow up. So what I mean by when I say if the signature is different, I mean that if you go through and you try to change the workflow and say, let me add a new variable. Well, that variable is seen as a public property on the workflow. When you make changes to it, it's actually going to, it'll actually change the signature of the workflow, and the workflow cannot be restored if it's asleep, because its signature doesn't match what was actually saved when it was persisted. So there are some changes you can make. I would just strongly recommend that you actually go to create a brand new workflow. Take what you have, save it as a new name, even if you've got a number on the end of it. Save it as a new name, and then go from there. What I tend to do is I'll take the workflow that's out there, I will create a new one, I will give it put a date on it, or give it a slightly different name. I will make my changes and publish it, and I will take the old workflow and I'll do two things. I will first rename it. I won't make any other changes, but I'll rename it, and then I will also go in to say something like obsolete, and then I will say don't allow anybody else to start a new workflow based off of this workflow. So that way any existing ones can finish using that old business process, but nobody can use it for anything new. All right.
And Andrew,
so another question.
I'm just sorry. I was just going to say that the one question that's right after that one by Anders is something very similar as well. You might want to just put on that as well. That once again talking about ALM, how do we roll out these workflows from dev to production and all the stuff in between? So integration, testing, staging, all that stuff.
Yep. I was actually just getting ready to answer Anders. So Anders is asking another question that's based on what we just said. How do I maintain SharePoint Designer workflows? Meaning, how do I do updates, rollouts to large farms? How do you manage the application lifecycle? Generally speaking, and I don't mean to sound kind of quip about this, but generally speaking, anything around ALM and SharePoint, I do it very, very carefully. SharePoint is this massive application, and it always scares the heck out of me when I have to roll out something new into SharePoint because I'm afraid it's going to blow something else up. I try to make very small changes, and one of the ways I do that is with workflows. I never update an existing workflow. I may change the metadata around it, like the name of the workflow and if it's allowed to have any new instances or stuff like that. But I don't change an existing workflow because I have no idea if the desired effect is to change new workflows or to let existing business processes finish off on the existing workflow, or if those business processes should stop and start using the new one. So, and because SharePoint is so heavily adopted in our organizations, I don't like to make the assumption that I know best. I like to make the assumption that my users know best, which we all know is already a very dangerous thing, that users actually know best. You just have to kind of, I don't know how to say it. You just be very careful. I try to do everything in workflow. I try and make everything very atomic and very separate from any changes I make. I go through and do one at a time. It's weird. I will say, it is, from my perspective, it is kind of a weird way of approaching stuff because as a developer, I should be able to always update something. But in this case here, you're really changing a business process, not just a piece of code. So you've got to be really careful about that. Okay. Okay. Let's see here. Got another question here. What DLLs do I need for the solution? I may have missed this. It was already mentioned. Oh, so what references do I need? So good question. For both of them, there's when you go to create a new workflow, you add in the activity, I think the activity is coming from, let's see, what was the code for this? There's inside the workflow component model and workflow activities, those guys are going through, I see the component model is the only one being used. The other ones that are gray are not being used here. I need the component model, and component model is going to be inside of system.workflow.component model. And then also going to need workflow and workflow actions, which you're going to have inside of SharePoint and workflow actions. Those are the two assemblies that you're going to need for that. And then any additional ones that your custom stuff may require, such as if you're talking to web services or you're talking like an OData or a RESTful service, it just depends. Let's see here, another question. Let's see, another question. If we want to add or update an external database table as the workflow status is changing, can we create a component in Visual Studio and use it from within SharePoint Designer workflow as demoed in the webinar? That is exactly the scenario that you would create a custom action for. That's a prime example because SharePoint Designer can't write to a database, but you can create one that would be a fully trusted action. You can't do it with a sandbox action because sandbox can't talk to database. But you can do it with a fully trusted one and let that fully trusted action go up, make updates into a table for you. That's a perfect scenario for this. Let's see here. Can you have access to the sample code that was demoed? Actually, yes, you definitely can. Here's what I did, is that the two samples I showed you are actually from our book. And the reason I did that is because going through each one of these, the reason why I showed you existing ones instead of trying to build them is because I would have run out of time pretty quick. So what I chose to do was to go through and to take two examples that were already out there and actually had a lot more stuff written around these two examples, so that if you want to dig in a little bit deeper and get a little bit deeper understanding, then I would recommend that I'd recommend you go take a look at the book. So the book I'm talking about is, and I'm not trying to make money off of you because if anybody else has written a book, you know that we don't make any money on books. So if you do a search for Inside SharePoint 2010 on Amazon, you'll find this book here called Inside SharePoint 2010 by MS Press, by myself, Ted Pattison, Scott Hillier, and David Mann. And in Chapter 11 is where we dig into the code for that. So if I come over here and look at the code for this guy, let's see. You find in Chapter 11, you'll find the two things that we actually I talked about here about creating custom actions and also custom sandbox actions. The other one you see there is creating a full-blown workflow with Visual Studio. So you've got access to those guys. If you go search on MS Press, go find the place where the book download is for the code. If you just want the code, you can go just download the code, but you don't get any kind of context around that. So that stuff's already available to you today. How do I upgrade actions from Visual Studio 2008 to Visual Studio 2010? The best way to do it is I just take the same way you would any other SharePoint project. The code is basically the same, especially for the fully trusted ones. The only thing that's different is if you want to make it a sandbox one, and then also the project structure, because we have the new dev tools. So basically what I would do is I would take a new project, and I would just copy the code file over to your new project, and then copy the actions file over, and then just kind of fix things up what come up. Okay. Can I use run with elevated privileges in a custom action? Yes, you can inside of a fully trusted custom action. You can't do it inside of a sandbox one. Let's see, where can I download the code samples? We just did that. Do a couple more questions here, and then I think we might be wrapping it up. Let's see. When you refer to creating new workflows, the question is, when you refer to creating new workflows to avoid blowups, are you referencing Visual Studio workflows or SharePoint Designer workflows? Personally, I throw them both in the same bucket, so I would say both. I generally do not like changing workflows that have already been built, but that's just my that's just my 2 cents. Okay, so you can take that for what it's worth. Let's see. For the person that asked about updating the database, why wouldn't I use BCS to do that? Good point to bring up there, Mark. The answer is maybe I didn't create an external list. Maybe I didn't to go through and to write to the database. Maybe there's other permissions around it. It all just kind of depends. Maybe I want to do an attachment because I can't do attachments in an external list. So it all just really depends. That was just an example that somebody had. Maybe they don't want to surface the data inside the database to everything else inside of SharePoint. They just want to write to some external system. Okay. Next question. You always get this question. Is it possible to control who has the ability to create or use the actions within SharePoint Designer? And the answer is no, you can't control who has access to the individual actions. Just like everything else in SharePoint Designer, you can just control who has the ability to go through and to modify to create workflows themselves. Okay.
And that's a big one. That just goes with just SharePoint Designer security in general. People, I don't know if everybody understands this completely or not. I just want to go ahead and intervene here and mention this, that SharePoint Designer, the software is not really for contributors and readers of the site. So folks need to remember that if you have the privilege to use these activities, then you have all the privilege for all the activities, because you are the site owner or you are the site collection owner or beyond. So no, you cannot, like Andrew said, you cannot really scope it out, so only few activities can be available for another person, other activities are available for a different person. But if you are there, that means you have the privilege to do all these things because you are a site owner. There are some restrictions you can put on SharePoint Designer for a person coming in that, hey, they cannot, for example, detach pages from the site definition, that what we used to call unghosting, ghosting kind of stuff, right? Or you cannot manage master pages, or you cannot manage the root structure of the website. So some of these kind of permissions you can change, but in terms of workflow, if you have it, you got everything.
Yep, that's a good point. That's definitely a good point. Any thoughts on using Visio Ultimate as input to developing workflows in Visual Studio? Yes, you can't. So technically you can. You can use Visio to design the workflow, import it into SharePoint Designer as a reusable workflow, save it, export it, and then import it into Visual Studio. I'm not a big fan of that, but it definitely can work. Honestly, I'm still much more of a, I still like the idea more of let's not build Visual Studio workflows. Let's use Visual Studio to build components to empower SharePoint Designer workflows. That's just my take. It's not just my take. I mean, that's the take that a lot of other people are doing as well. I mean, Asif, where do you stand with this whole thing to put you on the spot? How's that?
Well, as you know, and everybody else I'm sure knows, that I'm not a developer anymore, right? So I did used to develop a long time ago, but I'm not a developer anymore. So I love hearing an answer like this from a developer, like yourself, or I know Rob Bogue does the same kind of stuff. That, you know what, there are issues, there are ways to, of course, make workflows using Visual Studio, but it's better to just package up an activity. So now you have a nice perimeter of what a user can or cannot do within this activity, and then just export that directly to within a sandbox solution or within the farm, and then you can go ahead and declaratively use it. I won't be able to do justice to this question if I said yes, that's a good way of doing it, or no, it's not a good way of doing it, because I've not been a developer personally myself. But from you, Andrew, from Rob, the people I respect in the SharePoint workflow development phase, I've heard the same exact things, and I've not heard anybody else argue anything else than that also. So I'm going to go ahead and take your word for it.
The other thing too is, I mean, just even as a developer, I guess you like to go through and to put the propeller hat on every once in a while and get really low level and make some stuff really challenging, but workflow is just not fun. I mean, it's just a pain. Building custom workflows in Visual Studio is a pain, so I like to stay away from it. Well, let's see. Does it good to jump on state machine 1 when we can still do things on sequential? So the question about state machine, state machines are cool because they allow you to more closely model business process. They're only available inside of Visual Studio. However, they also are very complicated and very few people are using it. So I'd probably try to stay with sequential. If you're up for biting off state machine, then go for it. But if you do that, then you're building a custom workflow just in Visual Studio. Everything we're talking about here, it doesn't really apply. So. I saw one question come in. Let me just answer this one real fast. So can we use TFS to version workflows? You can use TFS to version the code that you're using to build workflows in Visual Studio, period. All the other stuff I talked about building custom workflows, customizing those, making updates to them, all that stuff still applies. I would still call them different names. That's just my take. That's just my take. Let's see. So
lots of questions still coming in. Wow.
Yeah, I just saw a bunch of them come in. So I see one I accidentally skipped over earlier. Richard asks, being new to Visual Studio, does the book you mentioned touch base on setting up the environment in Visual Studio if necessary? Thank you. So there's a very good answer to this, and the answer, well, let me give you the whole answer before you realize it's a good answer. So the answer is no, we don't cover that in the book. And the reason why is because things change, and we didn't want to go through and to write something in a book that was going to be pretty static when some new thing may come out. Service Pack 1 will come out and it may make changes. You may be building Silverlight stuff inside of your SharePoint web parts, and you want to make sure that you have the right Silverlight stuff. So let me show you something else that we did. This is a bit of shameless promotion here, so I'm going to apologize to Asa.
No, this is actually, I know what you're doing right now, and this is definitely worth everybody knowing of how to, I'm assuming you're saying how to build the machine, right? The one that you have, yeah, the white paper and also the videos associated with it, absolutely.
Yeah, so what we did is that we went through, when SharePoint first came out, we went through and we wrote a big document that shows how to go through and to build your own SharePoint environment, both if you have your own MSDN license and can set up your own, you have your own keys and everything, or if you're on more of a tighter budget and you want to be, you want to make sure that they're that everything is is using trial software. So what we did is, if you go to our site and go to the member section, you'll find underneath the articles section, you'll see this setup guide right here. So we've updated it 6 times, all just minor updates. But it's a PDF. I think it's like a 40 or 50 page PDF that walks you through the entire process of setting up your own virtual machine. You don't have to do it virtual. If you want to go through and install the stuff on Windows 7 or on a native install or using VMware or VirtualBox, that's fine. We wrote it to work with Hyper-V, and you can follow along close enough to where you see that you can't, where you can go through and switch it off to something else and use one of these other setups. But the whole thing, everything in this is all, it focuses around building a virtual machine. And there's a bunch of different steps, including links for where you download the trial stuff and what keys, where you get keys, and where you get trial keys. I'm not going to tell you where to get the license keys. That's kind of piracy stuff. Where you can download even a trial install of the VM that's already got Windows Server installed. And then we also have a YouTube channel. It's YouTube.channels/critical path training. Let's see if that's right. Nope. Critical path how about we just do critical path training channel. There we go. So we go to our channel here, and
killer ab workout. That's pretty awesome.
You like that? The ab workout. That was me. So here's our channel here, and if you look at our, we have a bunch of playlists, and one of our playlists that we have, I don't have, it looks like, what is this? This is probably flash blowing up on me right here.
Yeah.
But one of our things, you'll see critical path training, SharePoint 2010 virtual machine setup. These links go through the different steps inside the PDF that we have. So if you run into challenges, it'll walk you through how to do those pieces. So it's from setting up the OS to setting up Active Directory to installing SQL Server and all the settings you need to pick there, to installing Visual Studio, Office, SharePoint Designer, SharePoint 2010, and if you have it, Office Web Apps, and then some minor setup stuff, as well as some additional things like here's how you set it up for Silverlight development, and here's how you set it up for doing OpenXML, and all that kind of stuff. This is what we use. We use this to build VMs for all of our classes. So the class that Asif teaches for us, the class that I teach, we build our VMs based off of that document. So you'd be using a training kind of VM that's all set up for you, and it's bare bones. We don't have a bunch of extra junk in there that you don't need. So that's how I'd recommend you go check that out. That's just go to our site, criticalpathtraining.com, go to the member section. You'll find this link here. It's going to make you log in, but don't worry. If you don't have a login, just go create a new account. It's a free account. Set it all up. Go back, log in. You're good to go.
I'm going to vouch for this thing myself as well. I've used this document twice now to make virtual machines in 2 different instances, and seriously, anybody at any level of a SharePoint user, it could be a beginner, or it could be some really advanced person, is going to get extreme benefit out of this document, I think, because there's so many small steps that are documented so clearly with nice screenshots in this document, and of course, so you got the videos also if you just want to visualize it. I've not found any other resource, either by Microsoft or any other SharePoint MVP or anybody else out there that even comes close to this document. And I'm just saying this as a person who actually got this document and actually used it. I wasn't one of the creators of it. So thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate it. Sure,
no problem. Thanks, Asif. I appreciate that. I was going to try and open it up and realize that my VM that I'm in right now doesn't have Acrobat installed or a PDF reader, so I can't open it up. But the reason why it's so long, when I say 50 pages, some people are probably rolling their eyes like, oh, God, I'm not doing that. We put a ton of screenshots in there. So that's for your benefit. It's just, we wanted to make it a nice, children reading material, so at night reading your kids to sleep. Trust me, it'll put them to sleep.
It works.
Let's see. Okay, so we got a bunch more questions. How much time do we have, Asif?
That's going to be completely up to you, Andrew.
Okay. Why don't we go for I'll finish up the questions that we have here, and then I guess we'll call it then.
Sounds good.
Any other questions we put on Twitter?
Okay.
Can looping be introduced this way, or at least a retry count? Yeah. So creating a custom activity and say, I want to go through and to try and charge a credit card, and if it fails the first time, I want to try 4 more times. You create an activity that does that. I actually was going to go build a looping one for us for the sample today, but I was afraid that we would get kind of bogged down into, it would get a little complicated and bogged down for people that was just more of an intro. So
maybe just tell them how to buy it from you.
If I would build it?
Yeah.
First I have to build it. I don't know when I can do that. Let's see. We talked about ALM for changing workflows, but when you create a brand new workflow that will be deployed from development environment to QA and then to production, what will be the best way to do that? Also, how do you do that when Visual Studio components are also used in the SharePoint Designer workflow? So the whole answer is with solutions. So you use a WSP file. Everything is going to be packaged up in a WSP. So what you didn't see is that when I was building these things in Visual Studio, what they were doing behind the scenes was creating this thing called a WSP file. And that WSP file contains the DLL, the XML file, the feature definitions, all the stuff that needs to be deployed to the server. And you take that WSP, you push them out to the server. You then, by adding them using, if it's a sandbox solution, you can upload them to the solution gallery by just going to Site Settings, Solutions, and then say I want to upload a solution, and I look for a WSP file, right? Just finding it that way and uploading it. Or if you're doing a farm-based one, you have to give it to an administrator and let him use PowerShell to add and deploy the solution. That's going to be your best way to deploy anything that has any custom files from one environment to another one, is using a WSP file. Okay? Let's see. If you wanted to create a workflow that had a custom text boxes and fields that were populated based on previous user input, would it still be better to use custom components or blown out Visual Studio workflows? So this is different. So because you're asking about custom text boxes and fields that were populated based on previous input, that's not a custom activity. You're talking about custom forms. So that's going to be something you can do entirely inside of SharePoint Designer. You don't even need a custom action to do that, because anything that's visual, that's going to be a form. That's the value add that SharePoint provides, or one of the value adds that SharePoint provides to the workflow piece within SharePoint, is giving you a form-based capability. So you would use text boxes and for that kind of model.
And I'm going to add to this a little bit, Andrew. I did a webinar about a month ago on this specific topic of how you can modify SharePoint forms, all kind of forms, using either SharePoint Designer or InfoPath. So you might want to look into that webinar. Also, the recording for that webinar is available on our SharePointVideos.com site, and the recording for this webinar that Andrew is doing right now should be available also, by the way, next week on the site.
Cool. Let's see. So another question here. Do you also recommend SharePoint Designer to make changes to sites overall instead of features and WSP files with Visual Studio? Okay. So I say this kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's probably pretty true. And I think, Asif, you might agree with me on this.
Yep.
As a SharePoint instructor, I am contractually obligated to say it depends. The reason why I say this is because it totally depends on what you're doing. And it totally depends not only on what you're doing, but what your audience is. If you have a little team site, if we set up a team site for this webinar and we were only going to use it for this webinar, maybe for the next week, then I would do everything through the browser and with SharePoint Designer. If I needed to create a new list and I needed to create it in about 60 or 70 different sites, there's no way I would do it in SharePoint Designer, because it's going to be, I have to do it 60 or 70 times. If I do it using Visual Studio to create it as a feature, deploy it, and then I could write a little PowerShell script that makes that change and activates that feature 70 times, I'm going to be able to knock that out a heck of a lot faster and also a lot more reliably than making sure that somebody didn't forget to add this one little setting on this one list. It really depends on what you're doing. For me, SharePoint Designer and Visual Studio come down to this concept of customization and development. Let me pull something up for you really quick. So if you go to my blog and go to writing, SharePoint 2010, there is an article that I have on MSDN called Understanding and Creating Customized and Uncustomized Files in WSS 3.0. Everything still applies in SharePoint 2010. Okay, this article is going to walk you through this. It's going to walk you through about creating files. But what I want you to think about is think about lists, think about pages, all that kind of stuff. All the concepts still apply. Let's see. You all run down to this one little picture that I have showing here, right, which talks about where are your changes going to be saved. Do you want these changes living on the server, on the server somewhere, or do you want them living inside of a database? If I'm doing something that has a dev, QA, test, and production environments, then I don't want things living in this database, because this database is not about changes to my site. It's got one word in there right here that you see that I'm pointing to called content. Your site structure is saved with the content. You need to be careful with that, because I don't want my changes being stored here because then I can't very easily move this from one environment to another one because it'll overwrite all the data. However, putting it on the server, my content and my structure of my site can have a little more separation by putting the structure inside of the on the SharePoint server. So it really depends on what you're doing. I'm sorry I can't give you a more definitive answer. I say this in my class, and I hope that nobody takes offense to this. But considering a Supreme Court justice actually said this in the U.S., I think that I can get away with it. It's hard to go through and put your finger on exactly when you're supposed to go through and use SharePoint Designer, or when you want to stay away from it and use Visual Studio to make changes. What this justice said one time was somebody asked him a question to say, I need you to, what's your definition of what pornography is? And he said, I can't tell you what it is, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And it's one of those things that the more time you spend on working with it, you're just going to find more examples of when you need to do when one makes sense over the other one. Okay.
Well, that's quite a comparison.
SharePoint is a lot like porn. You like that? All right. How do I manage the change? You know, that was funny about this, and you guys are going to laugh at this, but I work from home, my home office, and my wife just walked into the office right when I said that last part about the SharePoint's like porn. So I got one heck of a look. Let's see. How do you manage the changes in GUIDs when you restore from backup to another server? Do you have a good way of doing it? So this is really outside the scope of workflow. I'm assuming you're talking about the changes of GUIDs with workflows, and in that case, the reason you're having that problem is because you're using backup and restore. If you want to go through and move stuff from one server to another one, you should be using import and export. They're very similar to backup and restore, but the idea is you import and export are designed to move a site from one place to another one, whereas backup and restore is used to back up a site and restore it back to where it was, not to move it somewhere else. So you need to look at import and export. All right. Sorry, one question came in that kind of caught me off guard. Let's see. Okay, so we'll do. I got about time for about 4 or 5 more questions. Okay.
Cool.
What if I deployed SharePoint Designer-based workflows on development and next move the site to production? Generally, Designer-based workflows cause errors in that case. Any particular way to avoid the situation? Asif, do you want to do this one?
No, I was not reading it with you. I'm sorry. Which one was that now?
The one by I think it's Ankur.
Ankur. Okay. What if I deploy designer-based workflows on development and next move the site to production? Yeah, generally designer-based workflows cause error in that case. Any particular way to avoid SUC situations? I'm not sure exactly what that means. Suck situations.
Yeah. It's a sucky situation.
A sucky situation, that's true. Let's see. So I'm not sure why he's saying that generally designer-based workflows cause error in that case. That's not what I've seen personally.
If you're doing backup and restore, it does.
Oh, okay. In that, gotcha. You know, I think this all comes back down to if I have stuff in production, do I open up sites in production directly with SharePoint Designer and manipulate things? That's I think that's underlying question for many of these kind of things. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. My answer to that is, you know what? Let me ask you guys this. When you manipulate a list or a library or even a out-of-the-box approval workflow or collect signatures workflow or collect disposition, whatever workflow, when you do these things in the browser, are you really making a new list or manipulating a schema of a list or whatever in development first and then you're doing these things in production? My guess is that 99.9% of you are going to say, no, that's not how we're doing it. We're actually doing it directly in production. And some might say, oh, how can you do that? How can you do things directly in production like that? Well, that's what SharePoint is all about. SharePoint is not really your the model that we used to use in ASP.NET a long time ago, where you take it from development and stage into production, not for everything, not for creation and manipulation of lists and libraries, and changing their schemas and workflows and stuff like that. So the answer is the same over here, that sometimes you really need to use SharePoint Designer directly in production. I know some people might say, hey, that is just not possible. Well, how can you even say that? But I've had these discussions with Microsoft as well about these things, and they agree that you can and you should be using SharePoint Designer in production. Of course, using it safely, maybe making some test sites also for doing some things that are going to impact directly the users. But the same thing here, if there's an error in the workflow, you might want to go ahead and deploy your workflow to a test site in production, because all the environmental variables are the same, and see exactly what the error is. Go ahead and manipulate things to make that error disappear, and then go ahead and do the same steps on your original site, but doing it still within production and not doing it in a development environment and then come into production. That's my stance on it, at least.
I knew where you were going with that. I'm right on the same page with you.
Awesome. This is the hardest argument to win, to be honest, because it's I've been in SharePoint Designer, of course, as you know, for a really, really long time, and I've seen since the front page days all the way till here. And there's a model that Microsoft is recommending that people go to, and many of the companies they're just not ready. They don't want to have SharePoint. They don't want SharePoint Designer and production to be used in the same sentence. That's it. That's just not possible, and they don't want to hear anything further.
Yeah, it's funny because like this whole that discussion, and then also the one that everybody's asking about, the ALM discussion. I did some work for them, MSDN. I guess I have another article I did for them about team-based development. What is it? Team-based development in SharePoint 2010. And in that one, they wanted to push this and make it an ALM article as well. And I pushed back pretty hard on that. They say they're going to put one out. The problem is that ALM to me, is something it's kind of like governance. You can't do an ALM class. You can't do a governance class because one size does not fit all. And it's more of either a consulting engagement or really just sitting down with somebody and really understanding how they do stuff, how big is the team, how big is the solution they're building, how many solutions are they building, are they just focusing on one big product, and it really just depends.
I agree.
So let's see. Okay, I got time for 2 more questions here. So let's see. This one, there's two questions by the same person here. Basically, the question is, how can I secure the workflows, and how can you secure the WSP file? So the answer is you can't really secure a WSP file in terms of blocking, saying only certain people can download this, because that's just not how it works. What you can do is you can say, if it's a sandbox solution, you say that nobody can download. The only people that can get to the sandbox solution gallery are people who have site collection administrator or owner rights. I think owner rights. I know definitely site collection administrator. I think owners can do it as well. As far as a farm-based solution, the only people that could ever get those are people who have console access, so access to the actual server. Now, when they do that, when they grab those files, there could be XML files, there could be ASPX files, there could be images, CSS, all kinds of stuff. As far as the DLL, that's in there, you can obfuscate it. You can do all kinds of stuff to encrypt your code. It'll still run, and just make it as hard as you can for people to go through and be able to read it and see that stuff. Okay. So, in terms of like physical security, you'd secure your WSP file the same way you'd secure your DLL. So, you just need to make sure that only you put it on the server, it's got to be able to run. You just make sure that the people who have access to the server where it is, only certain people can get to that. Let's see. And does Visual Studio Express allow us to extend SharePoint Designer workflows? I don't think so. I don't believe so. No, because I think it's the professional or the ultimate edition of Visual Studio has the SharePoint tools in it, which means that you couldn't go through and use Visual Studio Express to import a SharePoint Designer workflow. Now, with that being said, could you use it to augment? I believe that Visual Studio Express will allow us to build activities, but you're not going to get all the nice packaging stuff that we get with SharePoint Designer stuff, with the SharePoint Designer tool, the SharePoint developer tools inside Visual Studio 2010. Let's see. And then last question, can you do the workflow to the Record Center in SharePoint 2007? I see where you send it from a menu, but not automatically. Also, in SharePoint Designer 27, is there an activity to send to a Record Center? I thought there was.
Not specific. No, not. I'm pretty sure there isn't one. At least not in SharePoint Designer 2010. I don't remember being 2007 either. Let's see. I should just bring it up, shouldn't I? Maybe I should bring it up on my machine just to make sure. I'm pretty sure there isn't one for Record Center specifically. You can declare something a record, but declaring it a record just means, of course, in-place record, and not really sending it to Record Center.
Right.
So I'm actually going to try to bring something up in here as well while maybe you take another question and check it out.
Yeah, so somebody just followed up. 2007 doesn't have the send to action. So I guess it doesn't. Also, was double checking on that. Somebody's saying it doesn't, but that's something you could always create because there's something called the official file service, and so you could have a custom action that actually sends to the official file service, which would add it to the document repository or the record repository. Okay, and that's all the questions that I see here, Asif.
Great. Yeah, and I'm just looking at it right now. It says declare record, undeclare record, but there's nothing to move it to Record Center. In fact, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about this because I've actually gone through every activity and I documented it in our SharePoint Designer book that came out. There's nothing really that you can do to do things cross-site anyway, including sending anything to Record Center. But of course, like you said, yeah, but of course, like you said, you can go ahead and make it. You can make any activity you want. Make it, buy it. You know, one question that I have for you also, Andrew, and maybe this could be the last one that we talk about here, is there are lots of activities that people put out there for free, right? So maybe you make one, you put it out there on your blog, or somebody else makes one. And we used to have quite a bit on it on Codeplex for 2007. The folks who did it for 2007, they did not update 2010, those activities to 2010. But I'm sure there's somebody who's going to make it. They're going to make it. They're going to put it on Codeplex, or they're going to put it on their blog. How do you feel about using those activities that somebody makes, or maybe even reputable people, but somebody who is not really providing support for it? When they give it to you, how do you feel about telling a customer, hey, you can use this in production?
You know, it's a great question. Again, I have to say it depends. It really depends on what you're getting, right? And it depends on what you're getting, where you're getting it from, and then where you're using it. If it's a really critical thing that you're using, like on a corporate intranet, or you're in like a logistical company or something like that, and you're pulling something off of Codeplex, there's nothing wrong with pulling it off of Codeplex, but it's one of those things that I think that you should take a long, hard look at what they did and how they built it, because there's a lot of stuff out there where you see people doing some really dangerous stuff that they have been able to go through and to fix the problem, or fix a challenge they were running into, but it was not a good solution. So like the comical example that I like to give is that, you know, we've all gone through, we've all tried to, in our environment, tried to do something. As a developer, we've done it, as a user or whatever, and we haven't been able to do it. You find out that it's because you can't get to this one system because the network guys have the firewall set up to where it blocks me from getting there. And the right solution is to get an exception in the firewall to let me get to that one spot, and just a point-to-point thing. But what you see people doing is they just say, well, to fix that, I'm just going to remove the firewall. Does that fix the problem? Yes, it definitely does. But it was the wrong way to do it, and it introduces a much bigger problem. So you want to be careful with the stuff that you get, because it's somebody else has written the code. You just want to make sure you do a good code review on it and take a look at it. So it really just depends on what you're getting. If it's free, it's as good as what you paid for. So you really don't know if it's how good it really is. So you just need to kind of be careful there. If you're buying something from another company, you know, then you're in much better shape, right? You're in much better shape because you've got somebody that's on the line for it. Now, you want to make sure what company you buy it from. Is it a company you bought something from and you paid them with PayPal, or is it a company that, you know, and they were based in This is always scary. You don't want to say a country on a webinar because I don't want to sit there and throw somebody who happened to be on the webinar under the bus. But so the old joke, right, of the scam schemes that were coming out a year or two ago were coming all from Nigeria. So if it's somebody who wants to charge you something, charge you $500 for 1,000 activities, and you pay via PayPal, and the company is based in Nigeria, I would look at it a little more suspect than if the company was based in Canada or the United States or England or something like that. So it's buyer beware, I guess is a good way to say it.
You get what you pay for. I agree.
You get what you pay for. Have that discussion already.
Well, thanks a lot, Andrew. This is really, I really appreciate you coming and giving us an hour and a half with all these people coming in, and I think we've had a few hundred people actually, quite a few hundred people actually join this webinar. So this is I consider this a success, and we're recording this webinar like I said before. So we're gonna have this online. If you guys yourself want to review this stuff or have somebody else review it, there'll be a newsletter. It's gonna be coming from me next week. It's gonna have a link to the webinar. If you don't get the newsletter for some reason, you can still find it under the free videos tab. You'll find on SharePointVideos.com, you'll find the webinar. That's about it, I guess. That's all we have time for. I mean, we went on for an hour and a half now. This is awesome. Once again, thank you very much, Andrew. And all right, that's any last thoughts you have?
No, that's it. I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and glad everybody stuck around for this. I hope that you guys got something out of this. I know that I didn't give you step-by-step walking through all the code and we didn't build something, but I generally take the approach of you guys showed up for a webinar to learn something, not to watch somebody else debug a problem as they type. But at any rate, yeah, thank you very much.
And if you guys do want to learn some of these things, do a hands-on stuff, we have classes, as Andrew mentioned before, criticalpathtraining.com. Click on the Schedule tab, and you'll see all different upcoming classes taught by Andrew, especially for development, Ted Pattison, Dave Mann, Scott Hillier. These folks are really, really experts in what they do, especially in development for SharePoint. And if you want to do some non-code classes, come see me. You got some nice administrator courses and so forth. And if you have any suggestions for another course, hey, maybe tap Andrew for that as well.
Yep, I'd be very interested to hear that kind of feedback. So,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, love to talk to you. Love to hope to see somebody in the class sometime soon. I saw one or two people on the attendee list that were actually in there. So that's a little shout out. Say hey to Matt. So
that's great. All right. Well, take care, everyone. Thanks again for joining, and hope to see you next time. Take care.
Yep.